Athens County 911. What is your emergency?
Hello, I think my friend drank a little too much.
Okay, is he responsive?
He was, and then he's like kind of laid back, started passing out.
Okay, is he still breathing?
Yes, he's pretty in and out.
The caller, a friend of Collin Wiant, an 18-year-old pledge at Ohio University's Sigma Pi fraternity. The 911 call suggests Wiant was so inebriated he couldn't even stand up. But Wiant did not recover. He was pronounced dead at an Athens, Ohio hospital.
The university confirming that residence was an unofficial annex of the fraternity Sigma Pi, where Wiant recently pledged.
Ohio University has suspended Sigma Pi pending an investigation, accusing the fraternity of conduct that puts the health and safety of your members at risk.
Collin was the middle of my 5 children. He had an older brother, Austin, my oldest child. They were incredibly close. He looked up to Austin. Austin was his role model. His sister, Olivia, who's older than him, he was also very close to her. She was strong academically, as was Collin, so he really respected that and connected with her around that. He and his brother, Aiden, were 23 months apart, and they were connected at the hips. They shared a bedroom for 16 years. They had a really special relationship. And then his little sister, Ava, the youngest of our 5, he was very protective of her. When he passed away, the first thing we realized was how he had such an incredibly strong connection to each and every one of us. My daughter Ava always says he was the glue that kept our family together. He was always a fun kid, always very energetic, definitely quirky.
Collin was a little bit of everything, you know, precociousness. He was a really funny kid.
He had this smile that like lit up a room every time he walked into it, and he was just genuinely a great person.
He would walk in a room and you would feel his energy. People said it all the time, like he would come up to you and smile and you felt this big connection with him because his smile was so genuine and you could feel it.
He was just my best friend. We played sports together all the time, you know, shared a bunk bed for 16, 17 years. You know, he was a big competitor, but you know, whenever someone was, you know, down, he would always, you know, reach out a hand to pick them up, just always kind of like lifting up everyone.
He really cared about the underdog, and like no matter who you were, he was always going to look out for you.
He also had this really unusual sense, like he could walk in a room and if someone in that room felt like they didn't belong, he had this sense for feeling out who that was immediately, and he would go to them and he'd make sure they felt good and they felt like they belonged. And he always did that ever since he was young. I don't know how he got that gift, but he definitely had that gift.
He was a loyal friend, incredibly loyal family kid, and his friends, I guess for lack of a better term, they were friends till the end, right? Collin never had any enemies, you know. He was friends with everybody. And it was always funny, you know, we'd be somewhere and somebody would always say, "Hey, Collin." And he'd say, "Oh, yeah." And I'd say, "Who's that?" And he goes, "Oh, yeah, this guy I met through such and such and such and such, you know, and he plays basketball for this club team." And, you know, he seemed to know everybody, right? And everybody kind of knew Collin.
Collin was a very caring boyfriend. I had never felt so cared for by someone outside of my family. He was a jokester too. Our sarcasm got along pretty well.
It's funny because his relationship to my family was a lot different than my other friends. So I would have like 10 people over. Everyone would come in and just go downstairs to the basement. But Collin would come in and sit down with my mom or my dad or my sister and be like, "How are you? Like, how are you doing? How was work today?" or something like that. And you really noticed that he actually cared about my family because none of my other friends did that. And all my friends and I would like go downstairs, and he'd be up there for like half an hour to an hour, just like talking with my dad or something like that.
He was always busy. He always had something going on, you know. And he was also a really hard worker, very dedicated.
Unbelievably smart guy. I mean, there are so many times I remember thinking like, wow, he is so much smarter than I was at this age. So I really admired him, always.
When Collin started looking at colleges, he was pretty open-minded, and he was looking at a lot of colleges. He was looking at colleges in Chicago because his oldest brother, Austin, lived there. So we did a bunch of tours of colleges in Chicago.
He got accepted at Indiana, he got accepted at Loyola in Chicago.
But he really landed on Miami University. So he had it in his mind he was going to go there. And then right before National Decision Day, so the end of April, I remember he came into our room one night and he said, you know what, I've changed my mind. I want to go to Ohio University. And we're like, why? You've been so set on Miami. And he's like, they have this double major. It's like MIS and finance, and I think that's really going to get me where I want to go, and so I want to do that. And we're like, well, you've never even toured OU. And he's like, I've been there a million times with Austin. I'm like, it's not the same as touring it. You got to tour it. So the next day, we scheduled a tour, and we went down to Athens and did the tour.
Here's a place that's kind of close to home, but it's far enough away, and I'm getting a pretty decent scholarship to go there. So shortly after that, he just said, yeah, he goes, I feel like this is home for me. I really like OU, so. Wade
and I went to Ohio University. Wade and I were very involved in the Greek system at OU. As a matter of fact, we even met during Greek week. Some of the best memories of our life were at OU. August 24th, 2018. I remember getting up early that morning. We were in the house, you know, getting everything ready. I remember in the kitchen, I was making him pancakes because he loved pancakes. And I remember planning on going upstairs to wake him up, thinking I'd have to wake him up and be like, come on, we gotta pack up the car, time to go. And when I was making the pancakes, he bopped downstairs full of energy. He's like, okay, let's go. I'm like, oh my gosh, well, I made you breakfast. He's like, okay, we'll hurry up and eat and then let's go. Like, he was ready. He was so excited and he was ready. And we had breakfast and then packed up the car. And then it was his dad and I and his younger sister, Ava. And I remember the four of us driving to Athens, about an hour and 45 minutes away from Columbus. And I remember I kept crying and tearing up, but didn't want Collin to know. So I remember trying to hold that back a lot. I knew I was going to miss him a lot. When we dropped him off, I remember moving in all of his stuff, unloading all of his stuff, setting him up.
I remember hanging up his Laker flags in his dorm room and getting everything ready.
His roommate, Alex, we knew his parents, loved his parents, so all the parents helping the two boys get set up, and then afterwards took them out for pizza. Then when we were done, took them back to their dorm room, and they were both like, all right, you guys can go now. We're good.
I remember saying goodbye to him, and I've gone to every single one of my siblings' drop-offs at college, and never once did I cry. And I remember I cried because I was like, I can't believe he's going to college, because I just knew I would miss him so much.
After I dropped him off, I remember posting on Facebook saying, I just left a piece of my heart in Athens. And I think of that all the time. After he was there a couple of weeks, I remember he called us and he said, yeah, a bunch of the guys in the dorm are going through Rush, so I thought I'd just check it out with them. I was like, okay, fine.
He said he had got a couple bids, and he said he was really interested in Sigma Pi's, and they weren't around when we were in school, so yeah, it didn't really register with me. And I was like, you know, probably the standard conversation. What do you like about him? That kind of thing. He said, pretty laid back guys. A couple of the guys enjoyed, you know, working out and some of the things that he liked too, right? So he just felt really comfortable there. So, you know, when he told me that he was going to take their bid, I wasn't surprised at all, but he talked a lot about them.
I remember thinking, I've never heard of Sigma Pi. Like, I was Greek, I've never heard of them, so I went and looked them up. And then I found out that they were a huge fraternity, and a national fraternity, that they've been around for a long time, that they had a strong history and a large national presence, and I didn't find anything bad. So I felt like, okay, this is a good fraternity. When we went to see him on Parents' Weekend, he was really excited for us to see his life there, how connected he was there. So we would walk down Court Street, the main street in Athens. Like every fifth kid who would walk by Collin would be like, dude, how are you? Or like, hey, what's up? Like, he knew all these kids. Here he was, like 18 years old. He'd been at college like 2 months, and he knew all these people. So I remember seeing that, thinking, yeah, this is Collin. This is so Collin. Like, he's already making roots here, making friendships and connections. But we also noticed his grades were slipping the past couple weeks, and that was really concerning to us because that wasn't like Collin to just let that go. So the next morning, we had breakfast with him, and we brought up his grades. And we said, you know, your grades are really slipping here. I remember he said, yeah, I know that. I'm going to turn that around. I've just had so much going on. You know, I have my classes, and then I have my fraternity stuff and my pledging stuff. So it's a lot. And, you know, it's just fall quarter, me getting settled in. So he was going to address that. And then the night before, we had gone to his fraternity house.
And I remember him saying, yeah, well, it's not, you know, it's not really a house. It's, you know, an annex. We don't have a house yet. And I said, oh, okay. And that didn't seem alarming to me, but what did seem alarming was, you know, there were no letters, you know, in the house. Usually you can put some letters somewhere, like in the window or something.
And he's like, oh, I think they just like don't have them on right now. Like, I don't know if he thought that they got removed for grades, but it was something insignificant. He was like, yeah, they just don't have them on now. And we're like, well, usually if a Greek house doesn't have their letters, it means they lost them for a reason, like they were suspended for something. And he's like, no, 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 I don't think it's anything like that. I think they just didn't get around to, you know, putting them on there. So I just didn't feel like it was anything major.
And we said, hey, we want to come in and look around, you know, and he's like, oh, well, they're doing some work in there, and there's stuff in there, and I don't know, let me see. And we walked up, and then we met a couple of guys that were actives. And yeah, it's probably not a good time. The house is really trashed. You guys mind if, you know, maybe tomorrow or, you know, a couple weeks when you come out or something? And I said, oh, that's fine. Totally get it.
And I remember when we were at dinner with him that night, he was so distracted. I remember he kept checking his phone, and that wasn't like him. He was so distracted. And now I realize he was probably getting texts of things he had to do, and he was probably freaking out and stressing out that he wasn't doing these things. I thought that he was trying to figure out his new life in college with a demanding schedule and with independence and trying to figure out that balance. So I thought he just needs to settle in, and he'll figure out, when do I work out, when do I do my schoolwork, when do I do my fraternity stuff, and that he was just settling in.
My dad actually got diagnosed with cancer, and so we were all in town because my dad was telling us this. It made sense why we were all in town. He wanted to tell us all in person.
He asked me on the phone, Dad, is this something I should be worried about? And I told him flat out, I said, son, no, it's caught very early. I'm the luckiest guy in the world. We're gonna get it, take care of it, and we're not gonna have to turn back. I wanted him to focus on his grades. I wanted him to focus on acclimating himself to campus life and being the best him that he could be. And I just didn't want this to be a distraction. So I just played it like I did with all my kids. I just said, look, you don't have to worry about this.
The next day I took Collin back to OU, just talked, mentioning a few things about the fraternity where it was just like, huh, that's weird. Like they still, like that's an over-the-top thing. Like I'm fresh out of college, right? I'm like 2 years removed from college. I know what's going on at parties and stuff, and like him talking about how, like, pledges having to bring fanny packs with all the drugs and stuff in them to bars to supply the older people in the fraternity, and talking about getting whipped by belts and stuff and getting beat up, like physically beat up. And I remember thinking, I've always seen him hold his own and fight his own battles and make really wise decisions for someone his age, so I wasn't worried. But in my head, right, I'm thinking, I'm hearing all the stuff on the news that you've heard in the last 10 years of all this crazy stuff happening. And so you're aware of it, and that's in the back of your mind, but I'm not worried about him because I know he has a good head on his shoulder. And then I went and dropped him off at his dorm, and I told him I was proud of him and I loved him, and I gave him a hug, and that was the last time I saw him.
Our relationship consisted of us speaking nonstop. It was like texting all the time. All the time. If we're not with each other, we were talking to each other. There were rarely hours in between messages. Once he became a pledge, he stopped contacting me as much, stopped responding to my messages as much, and he would tell me that he's busy doing tasks for the fraternity, and I was extremely anxious. I feel like in my subconscious I knew that something was going on because we had just become so out of contact and felt like we had become strangers, even though we had plans to hang out the next week over Thanksgiving break.
He came home the weekend before he died. I remember right when he came in town, we picked him up. Next day we went to his sister's sports game, and I remember sitting in the bleachers and he and Aiden sitting in front of us, and they were goofing off and being playful like they always were. So that was very normal. And then I remember after that, we got in the car and they took me to the airport because I had a business trip. I just remember we pulled up to the airport, and right away he hopped out of the car. Like, I remember getting out of the car and all of a sudden seeing him right there with my suitcase. Like, he jumped out so fast and brought it over to me. And I remember telling him I loved him and I was proud of him. And I just remember holding him for the longest time. And I told him I loved him. And he said, "I love you too, Mama." And that was the last word he ever said to me.
I remember going to my parents' house because he was heading back. He talked with them for like 15 or 20 minutes and then looked over and he was just out on their couch. And I remember my dad saying, "Man, he is tired." And I said, "Yeah, he's been really busting at, academically and in this whole thing with Rush and everything like that." I said, hopefully things will calm down in the winter and, he'll be able to get back to a regular kind of routine.
He was not sleeping. He was not going to class. It was wake up, go do fraternity tasks all day, maybe catch a couple hours of sleep. He would nap instead of going to class if he wasn't not going to class to do tasks.
That night we were playing video games together and he said, "Aiden, I have something to tell you. I'm really scared." And he said that, I've been going through a lot of hazing, and, he was just really scared and wanted to tell me and say that it's okay and that he'll make it through to January, and then I can go see him.
I took him over to catch the bus to go back to Athens, and he got the 7 a.m. bus, and, I gave him a hug, and I said, "Hey, make me proud and be careful." He said, "Dad, always careful, it's good." And something didn't feel right, And I started to turn and go to the door to walk out to my car, and I turned around, and it was the weirdest thing. I turned around and I said, I better see and make sure that he gets on the bus okay. And I caught the last part of him going up the bus, and I said, "Okay, he's on, it's okay." But I don't know why I turned around like that. And I had no clue that's the last time I would see him again. But I just know that that hug that I got from him was just really strong. And I think he was trying to tell me that it was okay, that he's gonna get through this, because he kept saying, I just need to get through this. I just need to get through these next couple of weeks. And I run that through my mind maybe every other day. And I say to myself, why didn't I just turn around and grab him off that bus? And just hold him and take him back home and tell him, you know, hey man, just stay a couple more days. And that's what haunts me. Is that why wasn't I there? And why didn't I just grab him off that bus? But I know that it's not, that's not reality.
4 days before he passed, and I came to visit for my birthday and was texting him, and then we met. And I think there were 2 other guys from our high school, so it was nice to see everybody. And then he started talking about like his pledging and how they're like making him stay up and drink and take like Xanax and drugs and stuff like that. And I didn't even know like what pledging was. So to me, I was like so confused, and I didn't know how to like process any of that. I was leaving, so I walked up to him and I said that I was gonna go. And like always, like we gave each other a hug and told each other that we loved each other. And you don't really think about this is gonna be the last time that I'm gonna see somebody until it actually happens.
So that night, Collin goes to the fraternity annex house on Mill Street, and some of the guys are hanging out, watching a game, and one of the fraternity brothers pulls out a box of whippets and says, hey, we should all do this. So everyone's doing whippets. Collin takes a hit and has an asthma attack and goes into anaphylactic shock.
His eyes roll to the back of his head and he is in trouble. That's at about 2:50 in the morning. The response should have been immediate. The response should have been to call 911 right then and there. But instead, his first reaction was not to get help. It was to call the fraternity president to figure out how to handle the situation, right? The immediate thought was, how can we avoid getting in trouble for what's happening here? So some, 9 or 10 minutes, maybe even longer, went by before anybody was even called.
Athens County 911, where's your emergency?
Hello, I think my friend drank a little too much.
Okay, is he responsive?
He was, and then he's like kind of laid back, started passing out.
Okay, is he still breathing?
Yes, like he's like
okay.
He's pretty in and out.
911 gets there and started administering aid to Collin, and it was too late.
At 5:25 a.m. I was asleep in my bed, and I heard a knock at the door. I went down and opened the door. There were 2 police officers. They said, are you Kathleen Wiant? And I'm like, why? And they're like, can you get your husband? And now I was still half asleep, like you're trying to make out what's going on. I'm literally still half asleep. And I'm also getting defensive and worried. And then I see there's this other guy standing to the side, just standing there. And he's like in jeans and regular clothing. And now I'm wondering about him, and I'm like, well, who's that? And he said, that's the chaplain. And the minute he said those words, I knew it was one of my kids. And I was pretty certain that maybe they had died, but I knew it was Austin or Olivia or Collin, because those were the 3 that didn't live at home anymore. The other 2, Aiden and Ava, were upstairs sound asleep. And I said, which one of my kids is it? And they said, ma'am, we need you to get your husband. And I said, I understand exactly what's going on here. Tell me which one of my kids it is. And they said, ma'am, we need you to get your husband. And I started screaming up the steps and screaming really loud, "Wade, come here quick, it's bad, it's really bad. Come here quick, it's really bad." And I've never seen him move so fast. He came down the steps so fast that like the last 3 steps, he like kind of his heels slid down the last 3 steps. He was, and because I think he had never heard my voice sound like that.
I had a sense when I came down there, and the Dublin police chaplain had me sit down. He didn't have to say anything. I knew. I just didn't know who it was, and my mind was racing.
And I remember they said, "On behalf of the Dublin Police Department, we regret to inform you that at 3 a.m. this morning, your son, Collin Wiant, was found unresponsive at 45 Mill Street in Athens, Ohio."
And the last person that came to my mind was Collin. The last person. And when they said it was him, I couldn't see straight. It was just a vacuum. And I just remember crying, just being inconsolable. I just couldn't believe, what I was hearing. And we couldn't get any details. We didn't know what was going on until one of the policemen said that it was at a fraternity house, and in the middle of the night. And that's when my heart sunk, because I knew it had to be a party that got out of control, and it could have been hazing. And that was the first thing that came to my mind.
I just remember asking question after question. What happened? How'd he die? And I kept asking questions, and they didn't have information, and I kept asking the same questions. And they kept saying they found a few whippets around his body. That's all we have. When I realized we were at a dead end, that the police truly didn't know anything else, I quickly escorted them out, to the point that I think they were worried. They were so nice. They stayed parked outside of our house for all morning long, for hours and hours that day, just to make sure we were okay. And then Wade and I went upstairs.
And then my mom came in my room, and she told me to go in Aiden's room, that she had news, and she was crying, and I remember like thinking of something bad, but I never would have thought it was my brothers or my sister.
It was awful. It was awful. Kathleen just came right out and said it. We were on each of their beds, waking them up, making sure, "Now, do you understand? Can you hear me? Do you understand? Have you woken up?" "Yeah."
And they said the police just came to the door. They found Collin dead at the fraternity house. I didn't shed a tear. I was just sitting there. I was sitting up on my bed. Didn't believe it.
Then I remember all this going through my head like, oh my God, Collin died in front of kids, because they said there were people there. This is going to be on social media. And then I became terrified that Austin or Olivia were going to find out through social media. And I was terrified of that. So I called one of Olivia's roommates and said, Margaret, I have some very bad news for Olivia. I need you to wake her up, and I'm going to tell her, and then I need you to get her in the car and bring her home. Olivia got on the phone, I told her, and that was awful. And Margaret brought her home. And then I remember having to call Austin, and that was awful. Austin lived in Chicago, he lived alone.
Right away, you know from the tone that something bad's happened, and the first thing I think of is something happened to my dad, because we just got the news that he had cancer, everything. And then she told me Collin died, and I couldn't process it. I just remember dropping the phone and like taking a second before I really like freaked out, because I couldn't believe it.
You want to take care of your kids and your spouse and the people around you, and then it hits you, he's not coming back, you know, and it's why wasn't it me, and just not fair. And then you've got a bunch of questions that aren't answered. And as I remember, like a couple of days after they played the 911 call, and we were watching it in the morning on TV, and I just was like, what is happening, right? What is happening? My life is just upside down.
I'd been in that funeral home many, many times. That's where my grandparents' funeral was, my parents' funeral was. And I remember right when I entered the funeral room, I remember in this huge room at the end, I could see the casket and I could see his body. And I remember like my knees went weak and I grabbed the wall and I almost fainted. And it like took my breath away. And I just stood there for a minute and I remember thinking, my legs are not gonna get me there. Like, I didn't even think I could walk. It was the worst feeling. I remember just seeing his body and he looked so peaceful, but I couldn't believe my son was in that casket. I still can't believe he was in that casket.
That day, a line was like, people were coming up and going, I've been in line for 4 hours. And I was like, you gotta be kidding me. And that's when I first started to think to myself, man, he really touched a lot of lives. Because these weren't just our friends. These are a lot of young kids. And a lot of young kids that were just inconsolable. And then they would tell me these stories, and stories I never even heard, you know, and just phenomenal stuff. And then my son's eulogy was, like, I have no words. He had some prepared notes, but he didn't look at them. He spoke for probably a good 5 minutes, maybe more.
Collin had an innate ability to know when you needed him or needed something before you.
He was just talking in glowing terms about his brother and what he meant to him and what he meant to the community and things that he observed with his friends and what he stood for and, you know, why he loved him so much and respected him so much. And it was beautiful.
At the end of the funeral, there's the car that has the casket has to drive away. And the 100+ high school members lined up the street for the car to leave. And as the car slowly left, like, all the classmates got to say their last goodbye.
It was alumni and current students and everything, and we followed the hearse and drove out. It was beautiful. I mean, it was truly amazing.
I think it really shows how much people loved him and how much of an impact that he made on people's lives.
We had a small reception at our elementary school where all the kids went, and had people coming up to me and just, you know, not a dry eye and saying, Austin's eulogy was amazing. But he spoke from the heart, you know. And he was a special kid, you know, and you just get angry about how something like this could happen and take that kid away.
Collin's girlfriend came over, and I remember she pulled me into another room and said, I have something I have to tell you. And she said, I think it was the fraternity. And I said, why do you think that? And she said, they just were really bad, and they were making him do bad things, and there were drugs involved. Then I started thinking more about that. And by Wednesday, my husband and I started talking, and we were like, you know, you hear those hazing stories on the news. I mean, you never think it's gonna happen to your family, but you hear of those hazing stories. And could this be hazing? And we're like, it's probably not. Like, that's just crazy. So we decided, okay, we're gonna call a lawyer, but we wanna be very clear with that lawyer that we're not saying this is hazing. Like, we didn't want to be accusatory. We thought that would be a horrible thing to say. So I remember our first phone call with our lawyer, Rex. I remember saying, I want to be clear, we are not saying by any stretch this is hazing. We don't have evidence it's hazing. We just want to find out what it was. We don't really know how our son died. We want to look into it. And I remember Rex totally getting that, totally being like, I understand, we're just gonna get you answers about how your son died.
It was kind of reported early on as just, you know, some college kids in a room late at night, and somebody overdosed on drugs, right? In the course of our investigation, we learned that Collin Wiant had been the pledge class president of Sigma Pi, and that there had just been horrific acts of hazing that went on over the course of a couple months, to the point that Collin was literally exhausted. He was having a very difficult time in school, and this is a really smart kid. He had been on a trip to Gatlinburg that the fraternity affectionately called Fratlinburg.
He texted me and told me that it was one of the best and worst experiences of his life. One of the best because, you know, he felt so cool to be one of the freshmen there, but one of the worst because they whipped him with a belt. They stayed up all night doing drugs. They egged them. It's just physical abuse.
I think the thing that really broke things wide open for us was an interview we had with a non-fraternity member who had been with Collin at a bar down in Ohio University that night. And Collin had received a text message from one of the active fraternity members to be at the fraternity house at 2 o'clock in the morning.
And looked back up at Nick and said, "I gotta go to the house. I know they're gonna haze me." That's exactly what Collin said. "I've gotta go to the house. I know they're gonna haze me."
And this is at about 11:30 at night. And from there, Collin went back to his dorm and then headed down to the fraternity house as he was told to do. When we got information early on that Collin himself, as soon as he got that text, openly said, "Here we go again," we had a pretty good idea that this was a hazing incident and not just some random isolated incident among fraternity members.
The brazen audacity of a lot of these fraternity members that were more interested in covering their own asses and protecting this organization than speaking up for this young man that died. It's a lot of scrambling. A lot of the fraternity brothers, the older members, were meeting together, trying to figure out what to do. They gathered together all of their pledge class and formally initiated them into Sigma Pi that morning. It was basically a formality to make sure that all of these young men would keep their mouths shut, that when a university investigation would eventually happen, that they could say, you know, I'm a full member, I can't talk about that, or I wasn't there, I can't talk about that, instead of being compelled to tell the truth about their fraternity brother that died.
When I was sitting in my house, had just learned my son died, and I'm calling Austin to tell him that his brother died. I wish I knew that in Athens, Ohio, in that fraternity house, those leaders all called the pledges to the house and initiated them.
Kind of like showed the true nature of Greek life in general. It's very selfish and self-centered. It's supposed to be something that is a bringing together of groups and like molding to create a unit, and it's not that. It's very selfish. It's every man for yourself. And when shit hits the fan, it's get your story straight and scatter.
I don't understand how individuals can become just have such a lack of caring for another individual when they're supposed to be brothers. That's the one thing that blows my mind, is clearly every man for themselves and protect the fraternity itself, and, you know, cover your ass every second afterwards.
You're a brother now. You can't turn your back on brothers. You can't turn your back on the fraternity. This is your fraternity for life. These are your brothers for life. Absolutely, they initiated them to let them know this is who you're going to protect. There were four men in the room with Collin when he died. I can't imagine they didn't say, "We're not doing this. We're not having an initiation right now." Like, they had to be traumatized. They had to be traumatized. They just saw an 18-year-old die in front of them.
I don't use the word haunting lightly, but still haunts me to this day, is could he have been had they reacted sooner, could this have been avoided?
You hear stories on the news about hazing, and you hear different talks throughout high school or whatever, but you sit in those talks and you listen and you hear about all the bad stuff, but you never in a million years think it's going to be you. And you never in a million years think it's going to be your brother until it is.
Collin's level-headed. He wasn't going to put himself in a bad spot, which makes this all the more just crazy to me. But then again, Collin's a leader, and he had mentioned to me on a couple of occasions that, Dad, I'm going to get through the pledging part of it. And he goes, I think I can be a leader in this fraternity, and there's some things I want to change. And I was like, that's really cool, and so I mentioned his loyalty and his commitment to seeing things through, I think was kind of a perfect cocktail here,
Every single red flag there could have been, he straight up told me. He blatantly told me everything that was happening to him, but I disregarded it because he was happy that he was being accepted by them.
The hallmarks of hazing are that the acts begin small and innocent, right? You all have to show up at 11 o'clock at night and regurgitate the history or the lore of the university, and if you don't get it right, you got to do it again and again and again. Or you got to go run an errand for an active, or you might have to do some laundry or pick up food. But then from there, the grooming graduates, right? It escalates into more serious acts, and for some reason in the last 10 years, alcohol and drugs have been a really big component of the hazing circle. And there's a big difference between somebody at a bar that is even binge drinking and has the ability to say, I'm done, enough for me. Whereas in the hazing context, when somebody is handed a bottle of alcohol to drink and told to drink it before they leave the room, the fear is that if they don't, they're going to be bounced from the fraternity. So they feel as though they have no choice. In the case of Collin, he went up to that room that night. There were whippets all over the room, and he was told to ingest the whippets. And same thing, it doesn't matter if it's a liter of alcohol or if it's a whippet. At that moment, they feel like, I have got an obligation to do this, and if I don't, I'm going to be either bounced from the fraternity or I'm going to be shamed. I'm going to be viewed as a quitter or somebody who's weak, can't take it. So I think it's a completely different situation in the hazing context, because I think it removes real freedom of choice from these young kids.
From the moment that he decided to join Sigma Pi, he was raised up to pledge class president. He had this vision for himself of being a leader, being someone who could change the system from within, and ultimately became one of these people that he wanted so badly to help on the other side. He would think, if I could just get through the pledging process, if I can just become a full member, I could be part of this leadership team and ultimately really try and change this organization. And what's unfortunate is that it just never got to that point. I think back to the first two stories that we wrote, it was like, Ohio University student dead. And then when the autopsy came out, it was that this student had died and he had, drugs and alcohol in his system. The university didn't make it seem like anything suspicious had happened other than potentially where he had died, but that was kind of the end of it. We didn't know about all of the inner workings of this fraternity and what they were doing to try and cover up his death and their involvement in it. At that point, it was just a student died. During this time, the university was starting to investigate. There are these university councils, tribunals basically, kind of mock trials where there's no legal proceedings necessarily, but it's the university trying to investigate and hold these young men account to figure out what happened. So that goes on for a few weeks. The university is trying to investigate, talk to these fraternity members, figure out what happened. They ultimately realized that there was hazing taking place in this fraternity. By talking to pledges who had since left the pledging process, were no longer involved with Sigma Pi, they realized that there was a lot of stuff going on here beneath the surface.
The stories are all over the place. Fraternity members told police one thing and the university another.
Yesterday, Ohio University ordered the fraternity and all of its members to immediately cease and desist all organizational activities.
They ended up calling a bunch of the fraternity brothers in to one of these hearings. It was, the university leaders, student life, deans having conversations with these young men. And these were private hearings. These were not something that was the public could come into, but they were all being recorded. And what we heard in these recordings were really shocking. It was university officials trying to figure out what was going on, ask these young men, what happened that night, what happened in the weeks leading up to Collin's death, and just time and time again, just refusing to answer, refusing to be held accountable for their actions. So you can see this power dynamic that these young men feel so accountable to the fraternity and to the fraternity officials rather than to answering for their actions from the university. And ultimately, the university decides, yeah, there's hazing taking place here and we can't have this. So they end up expelling the fraternity from campus. Sigma Pi is no longer a fraternity on Ohio University's campus.
The police didn't even begin their investigation until we went down to Athens and provided them with a packet of information that we had uncovered in our investigation. And then that led to further investigation by the police and indictments and criminal proceedings and the whole 9 yards. And the Athens police were very, very helpful in that process. What has been somewhat difficult is we certainly had obstruction from the active members who were not telling us the truth. Some refused to even speak to us when we called them.
He died in November. The charges were filed 1 year later, like almost to the week.
9 people are now facing charges related to alleged hazing at an off-campus house.
That's right, 3 of the 9 people that are facing charges in connection to Collin Wiant's death, they were right here at the Athens County Courthouse.
So we are here today for purposes of arraignment.
One of them charged with reckless homicide, another involuntary manslaughter. Many of the other charges range from drug trafficking to hazing.
In the past, the fraternity denied the hazing allegations. The university later expelled Sigma Pi.
I think to the college students that this sends a message regarding the magnitude of this and the consequences and how seriously this has been taken.
As to the 2 misdemeanors, the 1 count of hazing and then the other count which had been charged as an assault, which is part of the agreement that your attorney has negotiated with the state on your behalf, that would be being amended to a hazing as well. Do you understand each of those being misdemeanors of the 4th degree could carry fines of up to $250 and up to 30 days in jail for a total fine of $500 for 60 days?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay. And is it your wish to waive those rights and enter a plea of guilty today?
Yes, Your Honor.
I would just ask the court to adopt the agreement. I believe that Elijah, when he filled out his statement of guilt for the ACE contract, did identify the fact that he has learned that his conduct was inappropriate by not only hazing individuals, but also instructing them not to provide information to Ohio University during the investigation of Sigma Pi. So I hope that he also learns from that to echo the Wiant family and becomes somewhat of a voice for Sigma Pi and the rest of his brothers nationally in terms of trying to get hazing to stop and being a voice for that.
The most severe penalty that was ultimately handed down went to the young man who ended up calling 911. He was sentenced to 1 month in jail, which was the most that any of these young men got. The vast majority of them pled to lesser charges, or investigators, ultimately worked out deals with most of them.
The criminal process has been extraordinarily dissatisfying, not just in the state of Ohio, but in states all around the country, because in the state of Ohio, when Collin passed away, the penalty for a 4th degree misdemeanor is the equivalent of a parking ticket. And so even though these kids were, charged with crimes like manslaughter and reckless homicide, along with hazing, the reality is the juries see these 20 or 21-year-old kids that are behaving within a system that was created for them by adults. They seldom convict these kids on the serious murder charges because they don't want to ruin their lives. But they do convict them on the hazing violations. The problem is the hazing violations then involve very, very short prison sentences, a matter of days or weeks, and community service. That's just not a deterrent. It's not going to cause anybody to think twice about engaging in this activity.
When they were sentenced, I could not believe that. And then I was told, well, in Ohio, hazing's just a 4th degree misdemeanor, which is the equivalent of not paying your parking ticket. I was so angry And I remember thinking, they've got to change that. I remember that was my whole thought, that they need to change that. I never set out for me to change it. I set out to find who were the people who were gonna change this, because this was unacceptable. I was just looking for those people who were gonna change it.
So my name is Stephanie Coonsey. I'm a state senator here in Ohio. I am the sponsor of Collin's Law, which was Senate Bill 126, to strengthen our laws here in Ohio to prevent any additional deaths from hazing. It's kind of the heart of a mother who is on a mission, and I was just grateful to be a mother that got to partner with her. I had kids in college during the same time, and I think it really hit home that we send our kids off to school with big dreams and big hopes, and unfortunately Collin's ended in a nightmare that the Wiant family won't wake up from. And that just really sat with me upon hearing her story, meeting her. That void just won't be filled, and we don't want any family to suffer and go through that anymore.
Collin's Law does a few different things. Number one, it widens the definition of hazing in the state of Ohio. It makes known hazing criminal, which is really important. So now when coaches know this is a tradition that goes on our team and I just kind of turn a blind eye, now it's criminal for them to know about it. So now known hazing has to be reported. That's huge. Anti-hazing training is required of all students on all campuses. And hazing is now up to a third-degree felony in the state of Ohio. And last, and what is one of the most important pieces to me, is it has a transparency piece where now you can go on the website of any university in the state of Ohio. You can look up any one of their organizations and find out every violation of code of conduct they've had. That is significant to me, because when Collin said I'm pledging Sigma Pi Fraternity, I looked them up, found nothing bad. I did my homework. I did everything I knew how to do. If Collin's Law was in place, I would have seen that a few months prior, they sent a pledge to the ER with 8 staples to the head from a pledging activity. I also, with Collin's Law, would have seen that they were suspended a few years prior for hazing 15 pledges in the front yard in the middle of the night, stripped down and blindfolded. Wade and I would have read that and said, dear God, if that's what they're doing in public, what are they doing behind closed doors? Hopefully Collin would not have wanted to pledge that fraternity, but that doesn't matter. I can assure you, Wade and I would have said, oh, you're absolutely not pledging that fraternity. If just that one small piece of Collin's Law was in place, Collin would be alive today.
Putting a stop to hazing across Ohio, that has been Kathleen Wiant's goal the past 2 years.
The bill has received the required constitutional majority and is hereby passed and entitled.
With unanimous support, Ohio's House of Representatives passed Collin's Law, receiving a standing ovation from lawmakers.
I'm really hopeful that Collin's Law will become model legislation and encourage other states to pass similar protections for young people that are going to college in their state.
In a few moments, I will be signing Senate Bill 126, also known as Collin's Law. This bill passed the Senate unanimously. This bill passed the House unanimously. This is really a question of culture, and for decades, the culture of hazing has been accepted as something that is tolerated. This bill says that going forward, hazing in the state of Ohio is simply not tolerated.
Collin was a protector by nature. I can think of no greater way to honor him than a law in his name designed for the sole purpose of protecting others. Collin, I know you're watching, and I hope we made you proud. It's going to take courage from all of us to ask the uncomfortable questions of those groups when we suspect hazing's taken place.
No way. If this is what I think it is.
Kobe versus LeBron, the final chapter, February 10th, 2016, the Q.
That's so awesome, Collin.
Oh my God.